Good evening. My name is Nancy Leifer, and I am the president of the League of Women Voters of Montana, and I want to welcome you to this webinar on Revitalizing Democracy with the For the People Act. Thank you all for being here this evening. The League of Women Voters has been helping people understand and participate in democracy for over 100 years. We are a nonpartisan organization. We do not endorse candidates for office, and we do not endorse political parties. We do take positions on issues after a thorough process of study, discussion, and consensus. Today, the League is defending voting rights and working for fair elections. Especially with recent legislation in Montana, eliminating same-day voter registration and imposing new voter ID requirements to register and vote, the For the People Act could have a significant impact in Montana. So our purpose this evening is to provide more information on what is in the For the People Act so that we can understand it better and have a better understanding of how it might impact what's happening here in Montana. I'd like to also appreciate for a moment our co-sponsors for the evening, the American Association of University Women of Montana, Forward Montana Foundation, Jeanette Rankin Peace Center, the Montana Human Rights Network, the Sierra Club Montana chapter, and the local League of Women Voters chapters of Billings, Bozeman, Helena, and Missoula. So let me just say this evening, we're going to be dealing with the subject matter in two parts. Our first part features a presentation about the content of what actually is in For the People Act, and will be focused on understanding what it has in it and how it works. The second part of the evening will then focus on what's happening in Montana and how that and the For the People Act intersect. So we would entertain questions throughout that you can enter in the chat, in the Q&A box is the way to ask questions. We have a lot of people on this webinar, so we're not going to be having any kind of actual questions being expressed any other way because it gets too confusing. So if you do have a question, we please invite you to open up the Q&A and type your question right in there. Again, for the first half, it would be questions that would clarify, making sure we all understand what we've just been learning about what is in the Act. And then in the second half, we'll be looking at questions about Montana and how the two intersect. So thank you all for keeping that in mind. We're honored to have this evening with us two speakers from the Brennan Center for Justice. And I am just delighted and honored to have them be with us. I'm going to introduce both of them now, and then we will have, they will be presenting to us the content of For the People Act sequentially. So let me introduce both of them to start with. We have Dan Weiner, who serves as the Deputy Director of the Brennan Center's Election Reform Program, where he helps to lead the center's work on money and politics, election security, government ethics, and other democracy and rule of law issues. He writes and comments regularly for media outlets such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, Slate, MSNBC, and NPR. Dan previously served as senior counsel to Commissioner Ellen L. Weintraub at the Federal Election Commission, including during her term as the chair of the commission in 2013. He is a graduate of Harvard Law School, and before his service at the FEC, he practiced law in the Washington, D.C. area, and maintained an active pro bono practice focused on LGBTQ rights. So thank you, Dan. We're so happy to have you here this evening. Our other presenter from the Brennan Center is Elizabeth Hira. Elizabeth is a Spitzer Fellow and Policy Counsel with the Brennan Center, focusing on large-scale democracy reform that centers on equity. Elizabeth worked most recently as a lawyer in the US Congress, first for Senator Kamala Harris, developing federal policy on gender, equity, and civil rights, and later serving on the Committee on House Administration to develop the first version of the For the People Act for the 116th Congress. She has worked globally and domestically on equity for women, children, and underserved communities. Elizabeth earned her JD at Georgetown Law, and believe it or not, she used to work in the National Archives branch in Gardner, Montana. And she says it remains one of her very favorite places to this day. So welcome to both of you, and why don't you take it away, Dan?
Thank you so much, and it's such a pleasure to be with you tonight. It's a particular privilege because the state of Montana just has such an extraordinary history with democracy in this country. Not only barrier breaking, for instance, electing the first woman to Congress, but also a really amazing history of the protecting against, for instance, the corrupting power of money in politics, protecting voting rights, and guaranteeing fair redistricting. So Montana is really ways one of the sort of cradles of our democracy and our movement for democratic integrity. So it's a real privilege to be with you. The Brennan Center, where Elizabeth and I work, is a nonpartisan law and policy institute located in New York City and Washington, D.C. And democracy reform and revitalization is one of our signature issues, and the one Elizabeth and I both work on. And in that vein, many of the core principles and the policies in the For the People Act were developed either by the Brennan Center or with our involvement. So this is a bill that is very close to our hearts. And we really do think that it responds to this moment when our democracy is kind of facing twin crises, if you want. One being just the attack on democratic legitimacy that was exemplified by the January 6th insurrection. And then also, I think equally important, the kind of reckoning that we are facing with, our nation's history of imperfection and our history of inequity, and the kind of ongoing struggle that we're having right now that we see manifested, among other things, in the push around the country to restrict the right to vote. Voting rights is something that Elizabeth is going to address for you in a second, but I wanted to start by making clear that the For the People Act is a multifaceted bill that really addresses the many different aspects in which right now that our democracy is urgently in need of repair. And apart from voting, which Elizabeth will talk about, I think one of the other critical pieces of the bill is that it overhauls our campaign finance system. And in many respects follows the model that Montana has set with one of the most rigorous and strongest regulatory regimes in the country. But at the federal level, things are different. The 2020 election cost $14 billion. That was the most expensive US election in history, actually double what the 2016 election cost. And that's extraordinary, but from our perspective at the Brennan Center, the real issue is not just how much money, politics costs money, but where does that money come from? And what do the people who are giving that money want from the government? And in this instance, what we have seen in the decades since the Citizens United decision from the Supreme Court, which many of you are probably familiar with. Montana actually led the efforts to resist that decision that unfortunately did not succeed, is a major shift away from, rather towards a system that is where most of the money comes from a tiny class of the very largest donors. And what our research shows is that people who give $100,000 or more, donors of $100,000 or more, is a tiny group. It counts for far greater percentage of the total election spending than they did a decade ago. And in fact, in the 2018 midterms, which is one of the last years we have fully complete data, the roughly 3,200 people who gave $100,000 or more outspent all 7 million people who gave small contributions of $200 or less. And another recent study has shown that since 2009, a mere 13 megadonors, 13 individuals, have given $3.4 billion. That's 13 people accountable for $3.5 billion in our campaign system. And that has consequences. The concentration of wealth in our campaign finance system means that certain perspectives are privileged. And we actually have reams and reams of social science research that shows that on issue after issue, the preferences of the folks from whom the class from whom these mega donors are drawn outweighs the preferences of the overwhelming majority of American voters. And particularly that applies on what we might think of as kitchen table or bread and butter issues, jobs, the economy, healthcare, access to education, where you really see that, again, the preferences of the American people are not being enacted. And one recent example for that is, for instance, the struggle to pass an increase of the minimum wage, which hasn't been increased since 2006. That's something overwhelming majorities of Americans want, something that the folks who make up the kind of donor elite do not want. And interestingly, that doesn't seem to be something that they can pass through Congress. And in addition, of course, to all this money that is coming in from disclosed sources, we have the problem of dark money. So we have money also coming from sources that are undisclosed, which means that the problem essentially could even be worse than what we imagined, because actually a significant amount of the money coming into our system, often concentrated in the most competitive races, such as the Senate race that you just had in Montana, is actually opaque. We don't know where it's coming from. And then, apart from being an avenue for sort of American concentrated wealth, that is also an avenue for foreign funds to come into our elections, because there's really no way of tracing that money. So these problems are partly the result of the Citizens United decision. But I think it's important to recognize that actually Citizens United, and I'm a lawyer, I've studied this for years, didn't create entirely these problems. What it did by greenlighting all of these different types of spending is open various loopholes in our system that then Congress, and to some extent also the regulatory agencies involved, haven't closed. And so actually, a significant amount of what the For the People Act does, and we'll talk about it in a minute, is it sort of right-sizes our system after the Citizens United decision, closes these loopholes, and essentially, restores the kind of regulatory order that existed prior to the court's decision and prior to when everything started to break down. So how does it do that? So the first and most, I think, significant element of the For the People Act when it comes to money in politics is a voluntary small donor matching program. And what this would do, it's a kind of transformative policy, although the mechanics are pretty simple, is that for every dollar a participating candidate raises, that would be matched with $6 from public funds. And so essentially, if a candidate gets a $100 check, that check is matched with $600, and that's a $700 contribution. It does this without any use of taxpayer funds. The system is funded through a surcharge, primarily on corporate penalties. So there's no extra taxpayer burden. And the idea here is to make it possible for candidates to mount successful campaigns for office without relying primarily on this sort of small group of major donors. And obviously, this is particularly useful, I think, for middle and working class candidates who don't benefit from the sort of wealthy networks that many of the other people running for office do. And we know that disproportionately many of those folks are people of color, and particularly women of color. And some of our recent research actually shows that the For the People Act, with this part of the For the People Act, would cut the gap between women of color who struggle to raise the same money at the same rates as other candidates. It would cut that gap between them and other candidates by as much as a third. Interestingly, small donor matching is not a new concept. We've actually had it for presidential primaries since the 1970s. Every president from Gerald Ford to George W. Bush used the matching system and used the presidential public financing system. And it served them well. Ronald Reagan was actually reelected in a landslide under the system without holding a single fundraiser. It's also used in a number of states and localities. And what we've seen, in addition to the benefit to working class candidates and candidates of color, is that it generally allows candidates to raise more money from their own constituents. So they're spending more time, engaging with their constituents, learning about their concerns, and less time dialing for dollars. And we think in that respect, it really is a kind of a transformative reform that can address a lot of, frankly, the root causes of the political dysfunction that we've seen in our country that long predated, for instance, President Trump. who is sometimes blamed for many of the problems, but to the extent that there were excesses in that era, they were more symptoms of much deeper underlying problems. That's not all the For the People Act does. Another incredibly important point, and something that I know is dear to your hearts in Montana, is that it would close the loopholes that have allowed billions of dollars of dark money from undisclosed sources to flood into our elections. I'm going to give a shout out right now to your Senator, Jon Tester, who's been an amazing champion on this issue. Montana actually, as you probably all know, has some of the strongest political transparency rules in the country. So I think the benefits of transparency, and how it is that voters really deserve to know who is trying to influence them and what they want. That's in some ways the least that we can hope for in our political system. And again, I speak to many groups about Citizens United, but what I really want to emphasize here is that Citizens United did not make transparency unconstitutional. In fact, the court endorsed transparency. The problem is that Congress and regulators have not updated our transparency rules with the times. And so the For the People Act would do that. And then the last reform I want to highlight is that the For the People Act would overhaul the Federal Election Commission, where I work. A big part of the problems that we're facing today with campaign finance in particular is that the federal agency that regulates in this area is divided 3-3 between Democratic and Republican appointees. In this era of polarization, it was gridlocked before gridlock was cool. Sadly, sometimes they called it the canary in the coal mine. And the result really is that the agency hasn't updated its rules, and the rules that are on the books are rarely enforced, and then usually enforced against the sort of smallest players. So if you're a powerful incumbent in Washington, you don't have much to fear from the Federal Election Commission. And that is something, it's this kind of wonky issue that, might seem kind of abstract or remote, but actually that goes to the heart of so much of the dysfunction we're having right now. And the For the People Act would fix that. Now in particular, I think there is always a worry about an agency like that can be used to be weaponized, for instance, against the president's opponents. And the Federal Election Commission certainly does have potential power that makes that a concern. But the really ingenious thing about the For the People Act is that it threads that needle. What it would do is it would take this evenly divided agency, it would make it an odd number, but it would reserve one of the seats for a political independent. And there are elaborate rules to ensure that that person is a real political independent, so that we don't have a situation where an incumbent president tries to weaponize the agency against her or his opponents, but that we also have a functional regulator. So before I turn it over to Elizabeth, I just want to talk briefly about one other piece of the For the People Act, which I'm sure is very familiar, which is redistricting. So gerrymandering, I think, is a concept that you all are familiar with. Obviously, it's less of an issue in Montana because you have a very good system, but it is a problem in many other parts of the country. And I think what's wrong with gerrymandering hardly needs explanation. So politicians manipulating district lines so that they get to choose their voters instead of the voters choosing them. And by doing so, they get to cling to power even when they lose public support is self-evidently antithetical to basic democratic principles. And obviously gerrymandering has been with us for a long time. But what I think people don't always realize is that the combination of modern map drawing technology and then also geographic sorting and the increased number of states that are subject to one-party control means that it's a much, much more acute problem than it has been in the past. And the Supreme Court, unfortunately, has kind of thrown up its hands. It's conceded that gerrymandering is antithetical to democratic principles, but it's kind of said there's nothing much you can do about it in a 2019 decision. And so what we're really faced with, and we're looking at this cycle again, is another cycle where we're going to have a serious gerrymandering problem, particularly in that band of states in the Southeast, from Texas to Georgia and Florida. What the For the People Act would do, it would ban partisan gerrymandering. You could not take partisan affiliation into account in drawing district lines. It would specify other criteria, including protection for communities of color that states do need to use, and protection for what we call communities of interest, which are geographic regions that have shared interests or identities like a town or a neighborhood. It would make the process much more public and accessible. And then eventually it would require states to use the sorts of independent redistricting commission that you have in Montana. And it's been proven that that process generally does do a better job of ensuring fairness in redistricting. And that is another very important part of the For the People Act. So I think with that, I'm going to wrap up, and I am going to turn it over to Elizabeth to tell you about another really critical piece of this bill, which is its voting rights protections.
Thank you so much for having me. And as Nancy mentioned, Montana is one of my favorite places on the planet. So I almost feel like I have the pleasure of at least experiencing it through you remotely tonight, which is one of the silver linings of the pandemic, is we get to talk to people all over the country because this bill matters to so many of us everywhere. So thrilled for your engagement. When you could be doing so many other things, you're out here saving our democracy tonight. So Dan and I couldn't be more pleased. And Nancy, thank you so much for all the incredible organization to make this happen. So Dan did that beautiful coverage of all these things that you Montanans, and particularly the League of Women Voters, are on the bleeding edge of, because you're clearly leading the nation on thinking about these issues. But I have the great pleasure of getting to do my shtick about this, which is actually a little bit more, I think, unfortunately relevant in the moment that we find ourselves for all over the nation. So I'm sure you guys have heard the horrible news that, we at the Brennan Center have tracked quite even up to this month. We've seen in over 47 states, over 361 bills that are moving to suppress people's access to the vote. The justification that's being offered for these bills is the big lie about voter fraud, which we all know is a lie. And an important fact about this election is that Donald Trump's Department of Homeland Security did affirm that it was the most secure election that we have had actually in United States history. And so it's curious that it would be raised up as a cause for voter suppression bills nationally. But I think that the explanation for that is another really important fact about this election, which is that we have seen the highest turnout that we have seen in American elections in the last one, more than over a century's worth. So it's 120 years we haven't seen this level of turnout amongst American voters. And what that means is that people are actively engaged in participating in our democracy. And so I guess the unfortunate part of the dispiriting response has been for many states to try to push state level voter suppression, which unfortunately has a strong toehold while there is no federal minimum standard or no federal floor about what states need to do. So to quickly kind of preview, I'm sure you guys have heard about the horrible bill in Georgia that would ban folks from being able to distribute water to people who are standing in line, which we know really matters because in Georgia, we had voters in line for over 10 hours, right? We saw lines in Wisconsin, elderly voters with their walkers and their masks on because they had no option to be able to vote by mail to participate. So we've seen all sorts of proposals being floated nationally. In Florida, they've tried to ban drop boxes. New Hampshire wants to ban out-of-state college students from voting and eliminate same-day voter registration. Texas, this was beaten back, but they even had a horrible proposal to make people show proof of their disability before they could even access vote by mail. And again, these things are incredibly dispiriting, and we would be right to be cynical, except this is the great news I get to share with all of you. These things are beat back by this brilliant bill called the For the People Act. It is called HR1 because it was in the House Resolution 1. It is also called S1 now that it's moved to the Senate. And the For the People Act is this 818-page bill that I like to say is just full of comprehensive common sense reform that has been tried all across the country with great success in red and blue states. And so my goal tonight is to talk to you about two things. It is the content of the bill so that you don't have to read all 818 pages of it, but you can still be an ambassador to your community about what's in it. And I joke, like, unless you're trying to induce a coma, you don't want to read this whole bill. So this is a cheat sheet that should hopefully be useful for all of you. But then the second part of it, which is why I find it more than just a bill, it's the context of it, particularly within the civil rights moment of our country and the possibility for building an inclusive democracy, which is what Dan teed up for us so beautifully with that small dollar public financing. So first, the content of HR1. We know that over 150 million Americans participated in the last election, which is extraordinary. Guess what? HR1, through automatic voter registration, would bring an additional 50 million eligible Americans onto the rolls. And it's as simple as when you go to your DMV or other designated agencies like public universities and other places that are equipped to handle the questions appropriate to registering you to vote, they ask you, would you like to register to vote? You can say absolutely not. Then you carry on with your business, or you can say yes, please. And then you don't have to think about it again. Also, same-day voter registration, which again is used in some states, but not in all states, and actually particularly disproportionately benefits people of color and young people who are more likely to participate when there's that peak interest in elections toward election day. It would also offer 2 weeks of early voting, including weekends and before work. So what your babysitter schedule is, or whether you were late from work on that one Tuesday, didn't dictate your access to the franchise. And it would also let people who are formerly incarcerated vote, which again, we know really matters for those who are disproportionately represented, particularly communities of color, including Native American communities, as you all know in Montana. They're overrepresented in the incarcerated population. It does not ban voter ID in states. States are still free to use voter ID, but it instead provides an alternative so that you can provide a sworn written statement affirming your identity and still accessing your right to vote along your fellow citizens who have voter ID. It prohibits the provision of false statements or attempts to prevent voters from casting their ballots, which again, we've seen things like folks will say, hey, we can't wait to see you on election day on Wednesday, knowing full well that election day is actually Tuesday. And this bill just makes it clear that that is actually prohibited. There's a full-throated endorsement of the Voting Rights Act, which I'm sure we can talk about in the Q&A. And as Dan mentioned, it bans partisan gerrymandering and prohibits discriminatory voter purges, and also just covers a brilliant ethics reform that, again, is very simple. And you might ask, I can't believe we didn't have that in 2021. The Supreme Court is the only court in America that has no ethics requirements, and this bill would change that. So I could clearly go on about all 818 pages of it, but I think that's the core content that I think hopefully will kind of grab communities again in that common sense sort of way. And I'm just going to pivot now to the context of why this is not just another bill that's stapling together some common sense policies around gerrymandering and voting. I think it has a thematic picture. And for me, it's almost, I think of it as bookends. And if you've got a big bookshelf, you need a big, strong piece in the middle. So I've got 3 pieces here. And I think to earn this title that I like to think of, I think about the bill as the next great civil rights bill. And that is a lofty title to give it, but I think it's doing 3 things. 1, it is beating back really ugly, invidious discrimination, just blatant discrimination motivated, often racially, that we still see, unfortunately, persisting to this day. 2, it is instituting kind of neutral, facially neutral reforms that don't mention race, but end up really benefiting communities that we may not always be thinking of when we think about voting rights. And then 3rd, it is not only beating back bad stuff, but picturing what it would mean to actually have an inclusive democracy that represents all of us in America. So with those 3 sort of, I'm giving you my outline, let's walk you through the first part. So to discuss, unfortunately, invidious discrimination that still persists, the way that I like to do this is to give you what I think of as anecdotes, so that when you're talking to your friends about why this actually matters, you have a quick story to be able to share why this great piece of HR1 will make a difference. So for instance, I know Nancy and I talked about, obviously, we have a strong Native American population out in Montana. And like many other voters of color, Native Americans are often targeted by state level laws for disenfranchisement. So for instance, North Dakota was considering a terrible voter ID law. During the deliberation about that at the state legislative level, the Deputy Secretary of State actually mentioned to the state legislators in charge of the bill that the voter ID that they had under consideration had residential address requirements that would have a terrible impact on Native American voters, because for many of those voters, in order to get an ID that had a residential address requirement, would require an address. But for many voters who live on reservations, the government simply did not give them addresses. So they weren't even assigned the address that would have been requisite for them to have a legitimate voter ID. And even hearing that from the Deputy Secretary of State, the North Dakota State Legislature went ahead and passed this law requiring voter ID with addresses that simply was not accessible and well known to them to not be accessible to Native American population, which then caused, when we went, I was, with the Committee on House Administration, we did voting field hearings all across the country. And we had folks in tears telling us there are families on the reservation that are choosing between the $10 it takes to get this voter ID and milk and bread for a week. And so it's a real need that's felt within the community that I'm sure you guys have experienced among your fellow Montanans. And then another quick example that many of us who are engaged on these issues have heard of, unfortunately in North Carolina, the monster law, which we saw state legislative staffers went ahead and sent out a questionnaire saying, hey, can you tell us how different communities by color, how did Black folks vote, how did Hispanic folks vote, how did folks vote, how did white folks vote, which seems like it might be harmless demographic data collection until Shelby County v. Holder guts the Voting Rights Act. And suddenly folks are free to make changes that end up having discriminatory impacts. And what we see is that demographic data informed bills that went through the North Carolina legislature that just one-to-one knocked out the way that voters of color had been voting. So we saw that Black voters were likely to use early voting through Souls to the Polls, organized by their church to take elderly congregants from their little church service onto the bus and right to the polls. Because that was really used by Black voters, we saw it knocked out by this new bill, to the point that a federal court, this is not just me opining, a federal court wrote that this was targeting African Americans with, quote, surgical precision. This was just brazen. And it's not 1965, it's happening now. So parts of this bill would really be geared towards stopping that sort of voter suppression. And alongside the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, will just make that stuff history, as it should be. So that's part one. Part two is, again, those common sense problems that look facially neutral, but affect some communities more than others. Another one that really is stunning to me, like I said, the bill doesn't ban voter ID, but it provides alternatives. And in Texas, believe it or not, you can vote with your gun license, but you can't vote with your student ID. And again, that seems like a policy choice, maybe totally neutral, until you actually look under the demographic data and you realize that in Texas in 2018, of the students in the University of Texas system, over half of them were people of color. And people in 2018 who got gun licenses in Texas, 80% of them were white people. And I don't think those demographic facts were lost on the people who shaped the bill. Similarly, we often think about race, but these just voter suppression efforts and HR1 have really beneficial impacts across our intersecting identities. So, 80% of American women still change their name upon marriage or divorce. And it's often harder for us to go ahead and update those documents, as we're seeing right now in California with some barriers to women updating their real ID. So when you have a voter ID, knowing that a lot of women either lack access to or find it harder to get access to updated voter documents, you realize this actually impacts women as well. Same thing for trans voters. We know that over 965,000 transgender Americans are eligible to vote in the United States of America, but over 42% of them lack ID that accurately reflects their gender identity. And I want you to just put yourself in their shoes for a moment. What does that mean when you are looking at your ID and saying someone is going to judge whether my appearance fits what they think or whether my name fits what they think before I even have access to the polls? And again, I viscerally feel that that matters incredibly, not just because of the importance of the right to vote, but if you're a trans voter who's watching your state pass bills that affect you and your community and trans children, it hurts all the more that you don't get to access you don't get to exercise your right to vote, to participate in the democratic process that establishes the rules that govern your community. So I'll move from there to the third thing that I was talking about. So those are, again, facially neutral, seems like they're applied equally, but affect different communities differently. And the third part is the kicker, is what Dan teed up for us so beautifully with small dollar public financing. So right now, I think it's really important for us to just think about the context that we're in. And American government could do a stronger job of representing more Americans from all over, from all walks of life and all kinds of lived experience. And that's race, that's gender, that's LGBTQ status, that is disability status, language, just English as a second language, or any other number of things. And so I like to just think about what the current Congress looks like and how much wonderful work there is for us to do. So in that regard, I like to celebrate that the 117th Congress is the most diverse Congress that we've ever had in history, which is absolutely worth celebrating. That most diverse Congress is barely 1 in 4 women and 77% white. So 77% white, 73% male. And that's the most diverse Congress we've ever had in history. So there's clearly a lot of work to do to get an American table that looks like America. And it's not just race and gender. In the 116th Congress, fewer than 5% of Congresspeople in their biography reported ever having worked a blue-collar job, which kind of gives you some insight into why it was so hard to pass the minimum wage. If folks don't have experience with what it means to balance a budget as a working-class family, they might not prioritize working-class family issues. And similarly, I like to also point out to just other simple things, like, again, women in Congress did not have their own bathroom on the House floor until 2011. Prior to that, they had to walk to the public, away from the floor, away from votes, to be able to use the restroom. So these were not systems that were necessarily designed with folks like women in mind. And only 10 people in the entire history of Congress have ever given birth while serving in Congress. And thinking about that data point maybe gives you a little bit of insight into why we don't have things like paid family leave, right? Or universal childcare. Again, lived experience matters. So I want to lift up there Dan's brilliant analysis of small dollar public financing, diversifying candidates, especially those of us who are called unelectable. That's women, that's people of color, that's working class folks who can't afford to just full-time work on their candidacies. It brings all of those people to the table in a really powerful way. So I think that's where I want to leave it. I'm mindful of our time together, but I think that I want your takeaway from this to be, between all the brilliant pieces that Dan has raised about protecting us against partisan gerrymandering, about diversifying who has access to even run as a candidate, all the way up to making sure that every voter doesn't feel like she or he has to jump a hurdle to participate in democracy, because their voice belongs and they deserve that voice just like anybody else does. So I think that's the beauty and the brilliance of HR1. And I think that's the story that we need to tell about it. It's not just a bunch of good policies stapled together. It is a futuristic and inclusive and optimistic version of what we can all achieve and build together. So I'm thrilled to chat with you about it. And thank you so much for letting us chat with you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Dan. We have a couple of questions that came in the chat box. I'm going to take them in order. So we're going back to Dan for a moment. Dan, can you tell us more about the definition of small donor, and is there a monetary cap to qualify as a small donor?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Small donors under the federal system are people who gave $200 or less in aggregate. So if you give $50 4 times, you're a small donor. If you give $50 5 times, you're not a small donor anymore. And the system would only match contributions up to $200.
Great, thank you. So this is a question, I think, that combining two of them together, this bill is very long. And the other question that kind of plays off of that also is that it seems very complex. Would it be better to have a bill that is less complex, but perhaps doesn't try to achieve as much as this one is trying to do in terms of moving forward? Is that something how would you both respond to that question? Why don't you go first, Elizabeth? You need to, yeah, thank you.
Like he was gearing up. So Dan, you go ahead, because I've got my own answers to this. You go first.
Well, I want to hear your answers, but I think that actually, I think the way Elizabeth put it helps to explain why you need the bill the way it is. Like the things we need to do to repair our democracy intersect and are interlocking. We've got all of these different things that together, America is a wonderful country, but there are major problems right now that are festering and that are represented by a Congress that doesn't look like America, and a government that too often just doesn't seem to be responding to what people want. And I think we don't gain anything by, settling for less or negotiating against ourselves. I think this bill was crafted to address head on the major problems that we face. It is long. Bills, I think it is unfortunate in legislation that bills are so long, but I think that in substance, it really does try to tackle the issues that we need to tackle if we're going to kind of achieve the promise of American democracy. So while, it would be nice if it were shorter in terms of pages, I think it doesn't necessarily behoove us to start to try to chop it down and give up one part or another, because I think each are sort of equally essential. But Elizabeth, I'm sure you have thoughts to add to that too.
Yeah, I just, so we, like I said, when we worked on this bill in the last Congress and people would say it's very long, I always used to just get tickled, because I would think like, are you upset that Congress is doing its job? All of these things have been a problem for a really long time, right? And so like, I didn't even mention this in the intro, but like, people should not be in 2021 waiting in 10-hour lines to be able to vote. There's no reason for that, right? And I'm sure all of us have experienced viscerally that moment of just looking at this and going, why are the voter machines breaking down? Or why didn't they print enough ballots in advance? Or why do folks not have clarity on when you're supposed to return your ballot and what the postmark date needs to be? And it's that sort of, again, common sense, super simple stuff that's actually in the bill. And so I understand the idea. Sometimes we equate length with complexity. And I would also point out one of the things, and one of the reasons I really stand firmly behind the bill is Jean Lewis used to say all the time, these ideas have been around for honestly decades. Some of these bills have been, we've been voting by mail since the Civil War. So the idea of being able to just have one bill that kind of common sense codifies all of that feels like it's a boon, not just because, it's like important for democracy reform's sake, but it's acknowledging that functional government is a requisite foundation for us to actually get to the other work of governance. So if we want to address climate change or child hunger or, education systems, the things that all of us agree are really pressing for the government to get done instead of gridlock, this sort of, again, simple common sense thing to me clears out these obstacles that we keep being told are too complex to solve, when in fact they're really simple to solve, which is what's evidenced by the bill. And the Brennan Center has great resources that break down the sections of the bill. So it's not like it's a tapestry where all the pieces are interwoven. It literally, in many places, is just bills that are stapled together saying that's a problem, that's a problem, that's a problem. And I always say to people, when you go to a restaurant, you don't say, I'd like some basil now, bring me noodles in a half an hour, and maybe 2 years later, I'd like some chicken. You want the whole meal. Just get it done at one time. And so I don't see any reason. We're not winning anything. We're not gaining any converts by breaking it up. So why not just get it done so we can get on to the business of governance?
I would just want to add one thing, that this is going to be maybe a little off message from Elizabeth, but would I like on some level for us to have been tackling these problems all along and to have, each bill passed on its merits when it was introduced? Sure. But that's just not the system we live in right now. So the reality is that our democracy is facing these major challenges and we've got to fix them. And this is the moment, we have this historic moment to pass this historic bill. And to be quite frank, I don't know when there will be another opportunity. So I don't think that we're served really by trying to chop it down right now, because I think you're just giving up an opportunity to solve these really pressing problems. And I think we just need to take that into account.
I also just want to add to that. I think Dan's exactly right. The momentum that we have seen from when this bill was first passed. And I always talk about the day after, Dan, we talked the night that it passed the last time, right? And it was maybe page 4 of the New York Times the next day. And they were like, some technocratic bill got passed in the House. It's obviously going to die in the Senate. That's literally, all of us have been pouring our blood, sweat, and tears. I've been calling Dan at 11 o'clock saying, what's the answer to this policy question? No, nothing mattered. The New York Times said it didn't care. They didn't care. Fast forward this many years later, I could not have imagined that we would all be sitting here with you all in Montana and us in DC saying, here's the minutia of this important bill that suddenly has this momentum. And that's the difference, because you guys have been engaged in beating the drum about why this matters. And Washington listens to you. So if you say this matters, Washington goes, oh, it matters. And then they respond. So, it's almost like you walk into a room with authority and people listen to you. That's what the American people have done on this bill. And that's why it's moving.
Thank you. There's a couple of technical questions about the bill. The first one is, will the anti-gerrymandering provisions take place in time to affect the 2022 election?
So right now, there are a bunch of different provisions, but the short answer is yes. And if they pass it quickly, the all-important prohibition on partisan gerrymandering and the other guidelines would govern this cycle, redistricting cycle, which we know is very important. The question of setting up redistricting commissions is a little bit more complicated. There's a provision to do it, definitely in 2030, but possibly earlier. But what's critical, I think, is regardless of whether you can do that, I think the actual just prohibition on the kind of extreme partisan gerrymandering we're seeing would take effect immediately.
Great. And this question's for you, Elizabeth. Automatic voter registration is terrific, but what kind of technology would we need to have to make sure that it's safe? Are there state systems that have been working effectively?
So one of the most important bits of technology to make sure AVR is safe is the people who do it. And we have been very careful in the bill to make sure that the people who are in charge of automatically registering people at designated agencies are those who have experience in asking the important questions that we check for eligibility for. So that's things like people who have experience at the DMV or at your public university and saying, what is your citizenship status? Are you eligible? And it's important to also flag that, again, these are things that are being worked out even now. The bill is currently in markup, but I will say with confidence, and again, I refer back to what I raised earlier, AVR is one of the many elements of the bill that has been successfully implemented in states all across the country. 19 states and DC currently have automatic voter registration in place and have successfully done so. And again, what we see is that it really does increase the participation of people across the board. So I'm sure Nancy will follow up with you. We have a ton of great Brennan Center resources that really explain these issues in depth. So I'm just going to go ahead and take liberties and drop one in the chat right now that Dan was instrumental in writing, that just gives you quick summaries on all the big ticket items and will tell you where all of these elements of the bill have actively been implemented successfully in states.
And I think Elizabeth is absolutely right that the capacity right now to do AVR is pretty well established. accomplished. It's not a new thing. It's already fairly widespread, and I think that it can be implemented fairly easily.
Okay, thank you. I have a comment here that from a polling place manager that their mantra for election day is that election day is not for the parties and not for the candidates. Election day is for the voter. So that's something we should all keep in mind. How does HR1 relate to the John Lewis Voting Rights Act?
Elizabeth, do you want to take that one?
Sure, yeah. So the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, I think that both of them end up having really wonderful implications for equality and equitable access across the nation for all people, regardless of race or other status. But the difference is that what HR1 often addresses are systemic issues that are totally racially neutral that end up having disparate impacts on some communities, right? So when we were talking about same-day voter registration earlier, what we've seen from state level data, for instance, is that in North Carolina, Black voters are more likely to use same-day registration than some other methods, right? So again, same-day registration is available to every race, but it happens to have a benefit for voters of color, right? And again, it's quite neutral, but we do see that for systemic reasons and often systemic historical reasons, some groups are more left behind on certain issues and kind of need a bit more of a boost. Even things like, for instance, voting is maybe a generational habit, right? So a lot of people will talk about how my grandpa took me to the polls and I learned it from that way. Now, if you've been part of a community where that has not actually been even of access to you, right? Like I always like to remind people, 1/3 of Americans living today were alive during Jim Crow. This is not really deep history that we're talking about. And many communities are still recovering from being told that they should be left out. Asian Americans were not allowed to vote because they weren't allowed to become citizens for a very long time. And that's a damage that has continued throughout that community. So some of these facially neutral measures have those positive benefits. But the flip side of that is that the HR4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, that's currently being contemplated in Congress, deals with basically a regime in states that we saw had a history of discrimination. They had to go to the DOJ and get what's called pre-clearance when they wanted to make changes to basically have someone review, hey, is this change actually maybe meant to target a community? And so I'll reference back to that North Carolina law that I talked to you about. If you can draw a one-to-one connection between a bill and how it will hurt a community of color, that's what the John Lewis Voting Rights Act will stop through the pre-clearance regime. And when it was gutted in 2013, within hours, you had states moving bills that they knew they had been stopped from moving under a pre-clearance regime. So putting that back into place would kind of be the bookend to stop invidious racial discrimination, whereas HR1 takes a systemic overhaul that does benefit communities of color, but really benefits everybody. And it's a rising tide lifts all boats sort of strategy. So they both are needed together to be able to solve this problem of democracy access in America.
Thank you. We're going to stop on the clarification questions for the moment, and we'll have Elizabeth and Dan stay with us, and we'll come back at the end of our next section for some more discussion. So please stay with us, Elizabeth and Dan, and we'll see you briefly in a few minutes. And what we're going to do now is turn to a couple of people who are going to talk about what's been happening in Montana. As we know, there's been some legislation passed by the Montana legislative session this time around that has affected this. And I would like to introduce two more people to come and help us understand what's happening here in Montana. I would like to introduce to you Ruthie Barber. Ruthie is an issue advocacy organizer with Forward Montana and the Forward Montana Foundation, focused on voting rights within Montana's 67th legislative session. She is passionate about mountains and lakes and good food and making sure that every single Montanan has equitable, free, safe access to the ballot box. She believes that voting is a crucial avenue to having our voices heard and to help our democracy thrive. Ruthie worked tirelessly on Montana's census response, and thanks to her efforts and others, Montana was successful and gained a second congressional seat. When not in the office, Ruthie enjoys frolicking around with many Montana trails and looking for bodies of water to swim in. So welcome, Ruthie. And I'd also like to introduce Hayden Johnson. Hayden Johnson is a legal fellow for the Campaign Legal Center. He clerked for the Honorable Jill N. Parrish on the U.S. District Court for the District of Utah. And Hayden is a graduate of Georgetown Law School. And while there, he worked at the ACLU of the District of Columbia. He worked for the Public Citizens Litigation Group, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division's voting section, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and with the Honorable Wiley Y. Daniel on the U.S. District Court for the District of Colorado. Excuse me. He has also published research on the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Hayden hails from the Rocky Mountains also, and he is a proud Coloradan. And I'm happy to say that he was part of the legal team that represented the League of Women Voters of Montana in the lawsuit that we brought last fall in the Trump v. Bullock case in August and September of 2020. So welcome, Hayden. I think I'd like to start with you, Ruthie, to just give us a little update on what's been happening in Montana, and then Hayden will tell us more about how that might be remedied by the For the People Act.
Yes, thank you so much, Nancy. It's a pleasure to be here. And apologies if there's any background noises. My roommates are having a party is what it sounds like to me. But hello, everyone. My name is Ruthie. That introduction was half written by me and half written by somebody else. But also it's very, very excited to be here. Very exciting to hear about S1 / HR1. Yeah, just here to give y'all a quick background on sort of what's happening, what's gone down in the legislature, and particularly how that affects young voters and students. So yeah, my name is Ruthie. I'm an issue advocacy organizer with Forward Montana Foundation. And I've been focused on voting rights within Montana's legislative session. And so quick background on who we are at Forward Montana Foundation. We are the largest youth-led civic engagement organization in Montana. And we educate, engage, and organize young Montanans to shape their democracy, to improve their lives and the lives of their fellow Montanans. So what that looks like for us in terms of get out the vote work is really just making sure that young Montanans are registered to vote and have all the information they need to vote when election day comes. We register voters statewide, including on numerous college campuses across the state. We utilize in-person events and tabling and a number of digital tactics, including peer-to-peer and relational engagement. We also provide protection services leading up to election day and on election day in order to ensure that every voter across the state has the tools they need to cast a ballot. So that's a little bit about who we are. We have gotten to lobby within the legislature this session. And it's been a very unique experience. This was my first time within a legislature. And unfortunately, Montana's 67th legislative session has really not been very friendly to voting rights. So the bills we've seen during the session demonstrate a clear and concerning effort to change voting laws to fit this national narrative of election insecurity, which Elizabeth touched on a little bit already. Even though Montana, especially historically and currently, has been proven to have free and fair elections. And legislators this session have mounted a bunch of attacks on voting rights, but anything from access to absentee ballots to same-day voter registration, all of which really negatively impact young people and student voters. So we've seen some targeted attacks on student voters that I will just touch on briefly here. I believe Hayden will talk more about the specifics of this new voter ID law that was just passed, but it was amended to specifically remove student ID from the list of standalone voter ID that is acceptable. And I'm glad that Elizabeth mentioned that in Texas, you can vote with your concealed carry license, but not with your student ID, because that is sort of what this law is doing for us. In Montana, which is very sad. So this pretty much means that if you're a student who's used to using just their student ID to register and vote, you will also have to bring some additional documentation along with you to the polls. And that documentation needs to include your name and your Montana address. So if you are a new student or you're new to Montana, you might not have a documentation like that quite yet, and that will keep you from voting. It also just makes things more confusing, and it will make registration and the voting process more complicated, and definitely will confuse some students, and for us will just require that we are working very hard to make sure students know what they need to bring to the polls. We also saw a bill that ends same-day voter registration that that bill recently passed as well, and especially impactful to students because they are often very busy. And election day is the only day that the polls are open until 8 p.m. Until 8 p.m. So most of the time they're just open 9 to 5, and students might have a full-time job or be in classes during those times. So they may only have election day to register and vote, and that this law takes that away. Very exciting to hear about the changes that the For the People Act could potentially bring that back for us. So what this means for us is we're really going to have to urge young voters to register early and check their registration status as early as possible. But we know that people still fall through the cracks here. Some students really aren't very involved. And then on election day, they think they're registered and they're not. We do know that about 40% of the people that used same-day voter registration in the 2020 general election alone were people that were already registered to vote, but changed their precinct or changed their address. And so they just needed to make a very minor change, and they thought that they were registered with the correct address. And so this bill really is going to impact so many voters. 3,352 voters used same-day voter registration in the 2020 general election alone. So another bill is sort of a reincarnation of the Ballot Interference Prevention Act, or BIPA, if you've heard of it. This measure was struck down in the courts just last year due to its direct disenfranchisement of rural Native American voters. So what this bill does is it prohibits paid ballot collection. So organizations like ours, or Western Native Voice especially, will collect ballots for elderly voters, voters with disabilities, or rural Native American voters who live very far from their county elections office and can't get their ballot in time. So this bill essentially prohibits that type of collection, and it will very likely go to court as soon as it is signed into law. We're still urging a veto on it. But clerks and recorders are also very against this. It's super burdensome with lots of paperwork and record keeping requirements that they just don't feel like is necessary. So it's not a very, very interesting why are we trying to pass this bill when clearly it was just ruled unconstitutional. So simply put, lots of these laws that were passed will make it difficult for young voters and for students to vote. And we know that with increased difficulty comes decreased participation in the voting process. And we've already seen lawsuits on these bills, particularly on the voter ID bill, due to its direct disenfranchisement of students and low-income folks. We also saw a few bad bills die. I like to end with some positive news. There were a few bad bills that really targeted students that died. One of them was an attempt to make students and young people choose between registering to vote in their college address or being able to be filed as a dependent on their parents' taxes. So it was just a very weird cross between taxation and registration. And we were very, very happy to see that one go. Another one would have made absentee ballot services, a service that students use a lot, super, super difficult and convoluted and confusing. So while we're super glad these didn't make it to the governor's desk, many have, and we are just going to keep working on that and continue to build awareness about that. So thank you for having me on, and I'll definitely stay for questions. I'm going to pass y'all off to Hayden with the Campaign Legal Center.
Thank you for that, and I have to applaud our hosts, the League of Women Voters Montana, and Nancy, who has just been terrific to work with, who I got to know from this fall in the Trump v. Bullock case, and has been a great partner, and is just a force of nature there in Montana. So Montana is lucky to have her. So I've got a little bit of a slideshow, and I'll try to march through these slides fairly quickly because a lot of this has been covered. So, and what I'll basically do is kind of walk through some of the bills that Ruthie described and kind of match them up with what HR1 and S1 would do as described by our friends from the Brennan Center. So if you'll bear with me one moment, I'll pull up the slideshow here. right. All right. So assuming everyone can see that, as I've been introduced, I'm Hayden Johnson, Campaign Legal Center, and I'm an attorney there. And really, HR1 and S1 set a new baseline for reasonable voting and registration opportunities across the country. And in Montana, they would reverse some of the damage being done in the legislature this session with the elimination of same-day registration, the burdensome new voter ID requirements, and as Ruthie described, especially those that target student voters, and then this new limit on third-party ballot collection. So first, I just wanted to overview the 2020 Montana election, which was, by all accounts, a smashing success, especially under these difficult conditions of this year. For example, above 83% of Montanans voted using non-traditional measures, and this is new census data that came out just recently, and that means Montanans that voted early or voted by mail. Above 82.9% of Montanans voted using those measures, and that's a great increase from the past. In 26 compared to 2016. It's over a quarter or a third of Montanans voted using those measures when they didn't do so in 2016. So it shows that there's a real benefit to being able to use these alternative measures to voting that really improve access, and unfortunately are the types of improvements that the Montana legislature has gone after this year. So just to put them in raw numbers, these are the amount of voters who are registered, who actually voted, and that 81% turnout is the highest percentage rate that Montana's had since 1972, and especially for young voters, it was a 40% increase for voters in that bracket. So, as Nancy mentioned with the Trump v. Bullock case, this election has been, or the 2020 election was safe and secure, and Montana has no instances of fraud. And as Judge Dana Christensen found, there hasn't been a single instance identified in the last 20 years. So it's not even just, there's no widespread instances, there's just zero instances of that occurring. So the legislature, as I previewed, has responded by making voting harder for Montanans, and especially for the native voters and student voters. And let's look first at the Montana House Bill 176, which the governor signed into law on April 19th. And you can see in the highlighted text there, it just eliminates same-day registration and ends the registration period at noon the day before. As Ruthie described, a huge number of voters take advantage of using same-day registration, either because they weren't previously registered or they need to correct something on their registration. And now voters will show up in Montana if this law stands and be turned away from the polls when there's no good reason for doing that. And then if you look at HR1, it allows for, or provides that states have to permit same-day registration. So you can see in the highlighted text here, it says you can vote, you can register any day you're allowed to vote, including early voting, including on election day. And so, and as Elizabeth and Dan already described, it also provides automatic voter registration. So what that means, if a voter shows up at their local DMV office or social services office, they then have to opt out of registering to vote instead of having kind of an opt-in process like Montana currently has. So if you look at them together, Montana law closes registration at noon the Monday before election, and if you are unregistered or you have a outdated or incorrect registration, you just won't be able to vote at all. And the law after HR1 and S1 would dramatically improve that through same-day registration and automatic voter registration with the front-end opt-out provisions. And 20 states plus DC currently have the same-day registration. It was 21 just a few months ago when Montana was in that good group, and 19 states plus DC have the automatic voter registration. So now moving on to the registration and voter ID provisions. And you can see some of the language here, but I think the most telling part is this very subtle detail that I've highlighted on this slide, but is really revealing of what the legislature was trying to do with regards to student voters. And that's before SB 169, students could register and could vote using just showing their student ID. Now they have to show student ID plus these other things. And as Ruthie described, students don't always have easy access to a utility bill if they're living with their parents or in a dorm room. And students tend to do digital banking and might not have easy access to bank statements or when they show up to vote. And HR1 would really improve this, in particular for registration, by clarifying that for a voter to register, they only have to show the last 4 digits of their social security number. At the same time, for states that elect to have a voter ID, like Montana has had since 2003, a voter can say that they just can attest to their own identity without having to give an excuse for why they don't have an ID. And in the current provisions of SB 169, the voter has to attest under a sworn statement that they have some sort of reason why they don't have that ID. So to sum out the comparison, Montana law after SB 169 has ID requirements to register, to vote in person, and to vote by mail if the person is provisionally registered. And the law after HR1 and S1 dramatically reduces these burdens by allowing voters multiple options to prove their identity, including, most notably, when they vote in person, they can just swear to their identity under oath. So now going on to Montana HB 530, which is recently passed the legislature just this week and has been sent to the governor's desk. And it's now the third attempt in this legislative session to prevent voters, especially voters who live on some of the many reservations in Montana, from getting help, having their ballot brought to where it can be counted and processed. And here the bill says, you can see that no one can accept a pecuniary benefit for collecting or delivering ballots. And there's a great article in the Daily Montanan yesterday that talks about how the groups, the nonprofit groups that do this ballot collection would just be completely hamstrung by this provision, because people are paid to work for these organizations, and as part of their job duties is to help folks get their ballots to be counted and processed. And again, HB 406 was one of the prior efforts, and it was even more strict. It said basically only family members could deliver ballots, so it would get rid of this process altogether. So HR1 would correct this by allowing voters to designate the person of their choice to deliver their voted and sealed ballot. And the only limitation is that people who deliver ballots can't be compensated based on the number of ballots they deliver. So if you look at the comparison, the law after HB 530 cuts the legs out from under groups like Western Native Voice, who have paid employees that do ballot collection as part of their job duties. And HR1 would allow people to designate who they want to return their completed ballot, including a designee from Western Native Voice. So that's it for my presentation, and I appreciate the opportunity and welcome your questions about how particular provisions from HR1 might be applied to the new voting landscape in Montana after this legislative session.
Thank you, Hayden, and thank you, Ruthie. We have a few more questions in the chat box, and we have all of our panelists join us back again. And so let me go back and pick up where we left off. So we had a question about the automatic voter registration and how that would intersect with undocumented immigrants. As in undocumented immigrants may accidentally claim citizenship due to a misunderstanding. Is there any more comment that you'd like to make, Elizabeth, on how that might work for protecting undocumented immigrants from unknowingly getting caught up in something they shouldn't be doing?
This is something that the actual immigrants communities have really been actively involved as stakeholders on the bill. We were very careful in the 116th iteration to make sure that there were protections so that if you lack the requisite intent to unlawfully represent as yourself as a resident, there are protections for you. But I know Dan's been working a little more closely on current iterations of it for this bill. I don't know if you want to speak to it, Dan, or suffice it to say that there are existing protections that very clearly still maintain that voter fraud is still voter fraud and will always be illegal, and that folks who do not intend to get caught up in the system will not be penalized further.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. So there are, as Elizabeth says, numerous safeguards in the bill. First of all, the automatic voter registration generally, if an agency that's doing it already collects citizenship information, the opportunity to register would only be offered to a citizen, and if they don't, then you have to affirm your citizenship. But there are numerous sort of checks during the process that give someone the opportunity, if they're not a citizen, to make sure that they're not registered. In addition, though, it also contains kind of a safe harbor so that if you were inadvertently registered when you're not eligible, you can't be punished either criminally or through deportation. But I do want to be very clear, because this is some misinformation that has gone around about the bill. The bill does not change voting eligibility. If you are not eligible to vote, you still may not. And it also, if you are not eligible because you're not a citizen and you intentionally vote, that it doesn't protect you. If, however, you do somehow, despite all the safeguards, get registered inadvertently, that can't be used against you either in a criminal proceeding or in an immigration proceeding.
Thank you. So the next question would be, is there any way that the states would be able to erode the provisions of this bill over time?
I can jump in on that. I mean, I think as several of the other panelists said, the bill creates for voting, and I think that the question was directed at voting, a federal floor that would create a baseline standard. It does not federalize elections, as some critics. The states would continue to administer elections. And I think, those of us who work in this area would agree you can't prevent all mischief all the time. I think Elizabeth sort of illustrated that's one of the reasons why the John Lewis Act is so important. Like the For the People Act, HR1 creates this baseline set of standards, and then the John Lewis Act creates those additional safeguards to prevent the sort of mischief that could potentially still be done. I think, though, that it's indisputable that the act will make it much harder for states to infringe on the right to vote. But I don't know if my co-panelists want to elaborate on that or disagree.
I definitely, Dan, I always agree with you. But the other important thing to raise is an analogy I always use is that the existence of a federal highway system, thank goodness President Eisenhower, didn't mean that you couldn't have state roads, right? So this is a yes and sort of strategy. And it just means that we have better access for more people to a system that everyone who's eligible should have access to, right? That's the baseline of our democracy. But I think the other piece of it that's really important, sure, these federal laws create that standard so that there is state laws can't go under that. States are welcome to innovate above it. The other piece that's really important is that some of the 361 plus bills that I mentioned, they are really innovative in the levels and degrees to which they're going to suppress the vote. And Ruthie was talking about that, like we saw in Georgia with the water. I just put it on our legislative drafting hats. You would really have to stretch the imagination to come up with some of these levels of suppression. And I think as an overall picture, what's really important about For the People Act is that through its comprehensive provision of access to so many people, it removes the incentives for states to be creative and innovative in their methods of voter suppression, because the goal behind a lot of these bills are to make it as difficult as possible for different groups to have access. And by simply saying, well, these groups have access, like we remove the incentive to suppress, and in fact say, like, maybe have ideas that you are willing to have compete in the marketplace of ideas rather than try to stop, as my analogy is, you're knocking down other stalls in the marketplace of ideas, and actually just like go ahead and compete in the marketplace. That's how our political process should work. So I'd love to hear from Ruthie and Hayden about what they think too.
I actually have another question for them, if that's all right, unless either of you want to comment on this. Nope. Okay, so I have a question about Senate Bill 169. Does it eliminate voter registration drives or registration at community events as done by the League of Women Voters? And in addition, does it restrict dropping off multiple registrations to county offices?
I was going to let Hayden take this one, but he may know more than I do. But what 169, from my understanding, what 169 is really doing, I don't think there's much language in there about voter registration drives. It is mostly focused on voter ID. So during those voter registration events, the elector might need to bring additional ID if they don't have the undersigned, a Montana ID or license. However, I don't think that it's going to eliminate those drives, and thankfully so. And for restricting dropping off multiple registrations, I don't think there's any language in there about that, unless I'm wrong, Hayden. But I think dropping off registrations is permitted as of right now, as of the laws that have passed through, and thank goodness for that as well.
Agreed. I was being deferential to our local representative. Yes, there's nothing in SB 169 that would alter those two questions from the questioner. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Are there any states that do not purge their voting rolls? And if so, how do they remove the names of people who have died or have moved out of state? And can you just comment on purging voter rolls in general? I know Montana just passed a law that moved from doing their purges once every 2 years to doing a purge every year. Dan or Elizabeth?
I mean, I'll let others weigh in, but purging or list maintenance is the sort of technical term, is a regular part of the democratic process. And I'll let my co-panelists speak. I think, all jurisdictions maintain their voter rolls. If it's done responsibly and with due regard to making sure that you're not disenfranchising people who are still residing at their addresses and still eligible to vote, it's a normal part of the process. And S1, the For the People Act certainly doesn't end that. What it does is say that you have to have adequate safeguards to make sure that you're not tossing people off the rolls, without due cause. And again, you just come back to these equity issues. The irresponsible purge practices that are used, from looking for people whose names are the same to looking at people who moved more often or didn't return a card, disproportionately affect the most voters from the most vulnerable communities. So all that we're saying really is that list maintenance should be done, but it should be done responsibly in a way that's mindful, not to disenfranchise the most vulnerable members of our communities.
And I just think an additional point to that is exactly right. And you were seeing methods that were being used even with knowledge that they were going to disproportionately affect, as Ruthie was talking about, young people in particular may have addresses that are moving around. And if you say, if you don't respond to this postcard, you lose your right to vote, and you have no chance to cure that, maybe it's at your mom's address and you've been at college this whole time, right? And you don't realize that. We saw it in Georgia. Folks didn't know until they arrived at the polls that they had lost their opportunity to vote. And so HR1 would solve that by creating new criteria, including that you can't be purged for your failure to vote in a previous election. And again, failure to respond to something like a postcard. Again, challenges, this also really matters because we see people's right to vote being challenged for criteria that are, questionable, right? Like you should not have your right to vote questioned because of the language that you speak or the color of your skin. And as Dan mentioned, people of color are more likely to have common surnames, right? And so that was another reason that we saw purges happening. But finally, what's really important about HR1 is that it does require an opportunity to cure if you've been removed. And we were wrongly deny people their opportunity to come petition their removal from the rolls. And so people, if you didn't have the time to show up at the time that the hearing of the Board of Elections was happening, you were losing your right to vote and you had no opportunity to contest that. So That's the sort of thing that the safeguards in HR1 are protecting, while still maintaining, as Dan mentioned, the incredibly important role of keeping our rolls clean from folks who have moved and folks who have died. Both of those things can exist at the same time.
And I'll just add one thing, because I know the League does a lot of voter registration drives at naturalization ceremonies. And, it shows how important the informational inputs are to doing accurate list maintenance. For example, Texas, recently did a list maintenance program where they kicked a bunch of people off the voter rolls who had just naturalized and were U.S. citizens excited to exercise their right to vote for the first time in U.S. elections. And it goes to show that when list maintenance programs are done wrong, they harm voters who are in the most vulnerable state or who need the most help getting over the finish line to cast their ballot. And we should be having affirmative efforts to make that happen, not making it harder for those folks to vote.
Thank you. I have two more questions, and then that'll be about where we're going to have to end it up. So let me ask this first question. What are the chances that HR1 would not withstand a challenge in federal courts? That is, for example, let's say Montana's governor wants to preserve and protect our state's election law and sues in federal court. Would the Supreme Court be able to find a constitutional reason to strike down a particular provision of HR1?
Well, I would have bad news for the governor, that the Constitution, in the text of the Constitution, says that while the states set the rules for federal elections in the first instance, if Congress disagrees, Congress can set its own rules. The late Justice Antonin Scalia, no liberal, said that if, according to the text of the Constitution, Congress could write a whole election code for federal elections. So, and in fact, in a number of recent decisions that were not otherwise very favorable from a democracy perspective, the most conservative justices on the court basically said, not our problem, take it up with Congress. This is the text of the Constitution says this is Congress's responsibility. Now Congress is exercising its responsibility. So I don't think a challenge of that nature would be very likely to succeed.
Elizabeth, did you want to weigh in on that one, or Hayden?
The same thing, the Elections Clause, Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1 very clearly delineates this power. And I will also say again, we understand the scrutiny that this bill is under, and Congress and all of, again, the hundreds of advocates across the country that have been working on this for decades are not in the habit of wasting their time. So the constitutionality of this has been something that is top of mind for the people putting it together, and we all feel pretty strongly united in its constitutionality.
Great.
I'll just add one more thing, which is that, the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment have an unfulfilled promise of an equal right to vote. And what HR1 does, for many of the reasons that Elizabeth and Dan described, is it brings equity to the voting process by setting a new baseline with reasonable registration and voting protocols. And it really enforces that equality mantra just as much as it does, sort of a federal state dynamic.
Thank you. So my last question has come up from a lot of people, so I saved it till last, is what do you think are really the chances of this bill being passed in the Senate? What's a realistic assessment of that? And I can open that up to whoever you would like to respond to that one.
Well, I think that is an understandable question. And I guess the best response is that this is a big thing, and big things are hard. And nobody is not conscious of the tremendous challenge this presents. But this is the best opportunity. I think that we've had to pass really significant, democracy reforms in decades. And that doesn't mean it's a foregone conclusion. Obviously, there are hurdles. But I'll tell you that, and Elizabeth mentioned this before, if you compare this to when this bill passed in 2019, and it was on the 4th page of the New York Times, and everyone was like, yes, that's very nice, and now we'll move along. This time, if you're in DC, if you're talking to members of Congress, if you're talking to the interest groups that are involved, everyone feels that it's real and that there's a real shot. And that's because people understand the urgency of the moment. They understand the very real problems we're facing. Does that mean it's a foregone conclusion? Certainly not. And to a lot of extent, that depends on the American people and you know, the messages they. And so, you know, I really think that that's why, you know, a lot of it will depend in the coming months on how much people mobilize around this and how much they tell their members of Congress that this has to be a priority.
Okay.
Yes,
Elizabeth.
I would just add to that like this is, you know, my mercenary American optimism as an immigrant, but I have watched so many things in my life they have moved from the impossible to the inevitable, and only because we've treated them like they need to move that way. And I think that's exactly the story of HR1. And again, I think the difference here is that what we're seeing this time is that Americans are realizing that this belongs to every American. And these are just common sense things that once you raise them, once folks know what is in the bill, they are advocates for it. That's why we're having a conversation, you know, at 10:30 East Coast time with you all, because this belongs to you. And President Biden yesterday mentioned these bills like with the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, because they belong to every American. And it's foundational work that needs to get done. And thankfully, we live in a country still where our government is responsive to its people. And so, as Dan said, the more that they hear from you about this being your bill and a necessity and a requisite foundation to do the rest of the work of governance, they have to listen. I think they will.
Thank you. Thank you. And we're about out of time. I would just like to say to Hayden and Ruthie, if you have like a 30-second message you'd like to end with, you can do so now. Anything else you'd like to add? Just a kind of a blessing on the whole thing before we quit. Yes, Ruthie.
Yeah, well, I think that somebody, you know, asked how do we get this passed? And I think just really going off of what Elizabeth was saying, talk about it, spread the word. I think for young people, that's going to be social media. But I think there hasn't been enough press about this bill. And I think that the more that it can be in the public eye and the more that we can take ownership of it, the more likely it's going to be to pass. So take this information and use it. And I certainly will. So. Thank you.
Thank you. Hayden, you want to have the last word?
Well, that's a lot of pressure after all the great things that have been said, but I will add one thing. You know, this bill is called the For the People Act, and it's the people's bill. It's not the For the Politicians Act, because the politicians in place right now have succeeded under the current rules, and the people need to have an opportunity to bring them back to their constituents and pass the For the People Act to really reset the democratic system in a way that's pro-democracy, not pro-politician. So I'll end with that.
Thank you. Great way to end. Thank you. And I'd like just to say thank you again to our featured speakers this evening, Elizabeth Hira and Dan Weiner of the Brennan Center for Justice, Ruthie Barber from the Ford Montana Foundation, and Hayden Johnson from the Campaign Legal Center. Thank you for all of your great help this evening in helping us understand this bill. Thank you to all those who came and listened and were part of asking questions here in the audience, attendees. This recording will be available on the League of Women Voters Montana website in another day or so. And we will next also be focusing our attention on what's coming up with redistricting. So you can also go to our website for more information about that issue as well here in Montana. And so thank you all. Have a lovely evening. This concludes this webinar on revitalizing democracy with the For the People Act. Thank you very much.